All right, peace and blessings. It's March the 6th, the year 2018, Tuesday. We've got a 6-page affidavit here from Gregory W. Towerton. This will be scanned and uploaded the year of Jubilee to the David Hinkson page, along with the affidavit of the juror Ben S. Casey that said he would not have voted guilty had he known that Elvin Joe Swisher was lying on the witness stand. All right, this is the United States District Court, Eastern District of California, David Roland Hinkson, petitioner versus Warden Paul Copenhaver, respondent. Case number 1:13-CV01571-JLT, affidavit of Gregory W. Towerton. State of Idaho, County of Idaho. Gregory W. Towerton, having first been duly sworn upon his oath, deposes and says, 1. I am an individual of 57 years of age residing in Idaho County, Idaho. I am personally familiar with the facts stated in this affidavit of my own knowledge, except as to matters stated herein upon information and belief, and as to such matters I believe them to be true. 2. Before I retired, I was employed by the U.S. Air Force as a special agent in criminal investigations stationed in California with a top secret security clearance, and my division was responsible for the security of President Ronald Reagan when he visited the California White House. 3. In June 2002, I had a job as a deputy at the Idaho County Sheriff's Office and married the ex-wife of David R. Hinkson. The former Miss Hinkson and I, along with our children by prior marriages, lived and worked in Grangeville, Idaho. As a result, I became familiar with Mr. Hinkson's situation. It appears this is a sworn affidavit of a dude who married Hinkson's ex-wife. All right. Number 4, the company owned by Mr. Hinkson manufactures liquid minerals that are sold as dietary supplements through a business known as Water Oz, located near Grangeville, Idaho. 5. In November 2002, I learned that Mr. Hinkson had been arrested and released on his own recognizance based on FDA and IRS law violations. I don't know what we're fixing to get into. I have not read this, but typically a man and the woman who marries his ex-wife don't get along too well. But this will be interesting to see where this goes. Number 6, in April 2003, I became aware that Mr. Hinkson was rearrested and that his time detained based on allegations of solicitation of murder of federal officials stemming from the statements of his former housekeeper, Mariana Raff. Number 7, as it turns out, Miss Raff was an unreliable source of information for several reasons. First, she was using her status as a confidential informant to gain immunity from the theft of the $6,000 cash from Mr. Hinkson. Second, her credibility as a witness decreased as it was learned that she had committed several felonies after Mr. Hinkson's arrest, for which she was jailed and then released. Upon information, I believe that such release was secured at the request of the FBI as a grant of immunity from prosecution because she was a confidential informant against Mr. Hinkson. 8. Upon information, I believe that the issue that finally disqualified Miss Raff as a confidential informant against Mr. Hinkson was the lack of veracity to her claim that her brothers in Mexico had been hired by Mr. Hinkson as the hitmen to kill federal officials in the USA. Although Miss Raff had stated to the FBI that her brothers had done this before after more than a year of detention of Mr. Hinkson, the FBI received information that Miss Raff allegations about her brothers was unfounded because one of her brothers was an accountant and the other a businessman, and neither had the profile of a hired killer. 9. The false claims that Mr. Hinkson had hired Mexican murderers to kill federal officials were eventually dropped, only to be replaced by more false claims of murder solicitation by a grudge-holding individual named Elvin Joe Swisher of Cottonwood, Idaho, who had vowed to send Mr. Hinkson to jail for the rest of his life because Mr. Hinkson refused to pay $10,000 and other charges claimed by but not owed to Mr. Swisher. Mr. Swisher had been used as an independent contractor to test the content of liquid mineral for Water Oz. Number 10. Starting in April 2003, as he was awaiting trial in jail, Mr. Hinkson called me and, because of my background in investigations, asked me to consult with his attorney, Mr. Britt Groom of Grangeville, Idaho, related to procedures used by federal investigators. That's pretty amazing that Hinkson has a good relationship with the dude who married his ex-wife. And not only that, but the dude who married his ex-wife named Gregory W. Towerton is standing up for him. Number 11, in early July 2003, while at the law office of Attorney Groom, Mr. Richard Bellin was also present. Over a period of several months in conversations, Mr. Hinkson shared with me his concern that Mr. Bellin was trying to extort him into signing over one half of Mr. Hinkson's business. Seeing Mr. Bellin at Attorney Groom's office caused me to be wary of the circumstances and to pay close attention to the entire situation. 12. My discussion with Attorney Groom occurred in his inner office just off the reception area. As I was engaged in conversation with Attorney Groom, I observed that an older man had come to the reception desk of the law office and was making loud statements about Mr. Hinkson. The man was later identified to me as Elvin Joe Swisher. 13. I could see and hear Mr. Swisher from my position in Attorney Groom's inner office, and Mr. Swisher appeared to be in his 60s and in poor health as he was using both a walker and an oxygen bottle. 14. From the tone of his voice and the harsh manner in which he was speaking to the receptionist, Mr. Swisher appeared agitated as he was saying that he wanted Mr. Hinkson to purchase an atomic absorption mineral testing machine, AA machine, from him for $10,000 plus. He wanted some bills paid. 15. At that point, Mr. Swisher's conduct was causing a disturbance in the reception area, and Mr. Bellin stepped from Attorney Groom's inner office and went to speak with Mr. Swisher. Mr. Swisher continued expressing concerns about his desire to have Mr. Hinkson pay $10,000 for the AA machine and also to pay balances on what Mr. Swisher claimed were charges due for mineral testing. 16. At that time, and in response to something said by Mr. Bellin, which I could not hear, Mr. Swisher stated, "If I don't get paid $10,000 for this machine, I will go to Boise and make sure David Hinkson spends the rest of his life in jail." 17. At that point, Attorney Groom said that Mr. Swisher was just blowing hot air and he would handle Mr. Swisher's concerns. 18. In August 2003, I left my position with the Idaho County Sheriff's Office in order to accept a position as a general manager of Wateroz. During my tenure as general manager, Mr. Bellin and Mr. Swisher, who appeared to be working together, accused various employees at Wateroz of stealing money from the company. I investigated the issue and discovered that all monies were properly accounted for and that the money which supposedly had been stolen was simply set aside for Mr. Hinkson's legal defense. 19. During the period from August to December 2003, Mr. Swisher claimed that he had rights to certain items of property that belonged to Mr. Hinkson. On one occasion, Mr. Swisher was able to gain entrance into the Wateroz factory by making a claim that he had been designated by Mr. Hinkson to oversee certain liquid mineral making management practices within the Wateroz company. Eventually, I was able to determine that Mr. Swisher was not designated by Mr. Hinkson to perform any work for the business, and at that point I informed Mr. Swisher to leave the factory and not return. 20. On December the 4th, 2003, I was served with papers regarding a temporary restraining order allowing Mr. Bellin and his associates, including Mr. Swisher, to take control of Wateroz. Even though I was the general manager, I was told that I had to leave the building immediately and was not given an opportunity to look for a court order among the documents served, nor was I allowed to contact a lawyer before leaving. 21. After a week and a legal work by a new attorney, Mr. Hinkson, a new attorney for Mr. Hinkson, I was able to return to the Wateroz factory and resume my position as general manager. 22. In addition to the TRO seeking possession of Wateroz, Mr. Swisher filed a claim seeking I just can't answer all the phones that are ringing.
Hello? Yeah, he's making a video.
After a week in illegal work by new attorney for Mr. Hinkson, I was able to return to the Wateroz factory and resume my position as general manager. 22. In addition to the TRO seeking possession of Wateroz, Mr. Swisher filed a claim seeking some of Mr. Hinkson's property, including 20 acres of land and heavy equipment, as well as other items owned by Mr. Hinkson. 23. Eventually, through the civil courts of Idaho County, the lawsuit and claims by Mr. Bellin and Mr. Swisher were dismissed. 24. After a thorough investigation, I determined that nothing was owed by Mr. Hinkson to Mr. Swisher for either the AA machine, which was obsolete and not the proper equipment needed for the water Oz business, and there was nothing owed to Mr. Swisher for mineral testing, as all prior invoices had been paid. Thus, Mr. Swisher was not paid the $10,000 or any amounts he demanded. 25. Mr. Swisher, who had testified in favor of Mr. Hinkson on several occasions previous to July 2003, was given the opportunity by the FBI to fulfill his threat to send Mr. Hinkson to prison for the rest of his life by becoming a confidential informant and testifying in Mr. Hinkson's 2005 trial, claiming that he had been solicited to murder federal officials. 26. I am aware that Mr. Swisher's testimony as to being solicited by Mr. Hinkson in July or August 2002 was false, because that was shortly after I married Mr. Hinkson's ex-wife on June 30th, 2002, and Mr. Hinkson immediately left the state of Idaho on July 1st, 2002, the day after my wedding, taking his children with him on a driving vacation for the entire month of July to Colorado and then California, where the children's mother, my wife, and I kept track of them. Then, as to the month of August, I was aware that Mr. Hinkson was not in the state of Idaho, and upon information, I believe that Mr. Hinkson left the United States to attend a class in Venezuela and then to promote his product in the Ukraine for the entire month of August. 27. Based on my observation of Mr. Swisher's health in 2003, which upon information I believe was compromised by a heart attack he had suffered in June 2002, he was not a person who could be considered as a killer in a murder-for-hire plot because he was physically incapable of doing so, even when I observed him in July 2003, and it is Mr. Swisher's medical records that would prove the state of his health in the time frame when supposedly he was being solicited by Mr. Hinkson. Further affiant saith not. Signed, Gregory W. Towerton. Subscribed and sworn to me this 11th day of December 2013. Philisim Polatari. So here we got the dude who married Hinkson's ex-wife signing a sworn affidavit that Hinkson is innocent and Elvin Joe Swisher's a piece of lying crap. I mean, I just insanity what's going on in this world.